Section 10, The Borgias, Chapter 5, Part 2. This letter was a cause of great joy to the Holy Father. The aid of 4,000 or 5,000 Turks would be insufficient under the present circumstances, and would only serve to compromise the head of Christendom, while the sum of 300,000 ducats, that is, nearly 1,000,000 francs, was good to get in any sort of circumstances. It is true that, so long as de Gem lived, Alexander was drawing an income of 180,000 livres, which as a life annuity represented a capital of nearly 2 millions. But when one needs ready money, one ought to be able to make a sacrifice in the way of discount. All the same, Alexander formed no definite plan, resolved on acting as circumstances should indicate. But it was a more pressing business to decide how he should behave to the King of France. He had never anticipated the success of the French in Italy, and we have seen that he laid all the foundations of his family's future grandeur upon his alliance with the House of Aragon. But here was this house tottering, and a volcano more terrible than her own Vesuvius was threatening to swallow up Naples. He must therefore change his policy and attach himself to the victor. No easy matter, for Charles VIII was bitterly annoyed with the Pope for having refused him the investiture and given it to Aragon. In consequence, he sent Cardinal Francesco Piccolomini as an envoy to the king. This choice looked like a mistake at first, seeing that the ambassador was a nephew of Pius II, who had vigorously opposed the House of Anjou. But Alexander, in acting thus, had a second design, which could not be discerned by those around him. In fact, he had divined that Charles would not be fit to receive his envoy, and that, in the parleyings to which his unwillingness must give rise, Piccolomini would necessarily be brought into contact with the young king's advisers. Now, besides his ostensible mission to the king, Piccolomini had also secret instructions for the more influential among his counselors. These were Briconnet and Philippe de Luxembourg, and Piccolomini was authorized to promise a cardinal's hat to each of them. The result was just what Alexander had foreseen. His envoy could not gain admission to Charles and was obliged to confer with the people about him. This was what the Pope wished. Piccolomini returned to Rome with the king's refusal, but with a promise from Briconnet and Philippe de Luxembourg that they would use all their influence with Charles in favor of the Holy Father and prepare him to receive a fresh embassy. But the French all this time were advancing and never stopped more than 48 hours in any town, so that it became more and more urgent to get something settled with Charles. The king had entered Siena and Viterbo without striking a blow. Yves d'Allegre and Louis de Ligny had taken over Ostia from the hands of the Colonnas. Civita Vecchia and Coneto had opened their gates. The Orsini had submitted. Even John Sforza, the Pope's son-in-law, had retired from the alliance with Aragon. Alexander accordingly judged that the moment had come to abandon his ally, and sent to Charles the bishops of Concordia and Terni, and his confessor, Monsignore Graziano. They were charged to renew Briconnet and Philippe de Luxembourg the promise of the cardinalship, and had full powers of negotiation in the name of their master, both in case Charles should wish to include Alfonso II in the treaty, and in case he should refuse to sign an agreement with any other but the Pope alone. They found the mind of Charles influenced now by the insinuation of Giuliano della Rovera, who, himself a witness of the Pope's simony, pressed the king to summon a council and depose the head of the church, and now by the secret support given him by the bishops of Mans and San Malo. The end of it was that the king decided to form his own opinion about the matter and settle nothing beforehand, and continued his route, sending the ambassadors back to the Pope with the addition of the Marechal de Guise, the Seneschal de Beaucaire, and Jean de Ganay, the first president of the Paris Parliament. They were ordered to say to the Pope, 1. That the king wished above all things to be admitted into Rome without resistance, that on condition of a voluntary, frank, and loyal admission, he would respect the authority of the Holy Father and the privileges of the Church. 2. That the king desired that de Gem should be given up to him, in order that he might make use of him against the Sultan, when he should carry the war into Macedonia or Turkey or the Holy Land. 3. That the remaining conditions were so unimportant that they could be brought forward at the first conference. The ambassadors added that the French army was now only 2 days distant from Rome, and that in the evening of the day after next, Charles would probably arrive in person to demand an answer from His Holiness. It was useless to think of parleying with a prince who acted in such expeditious fashion as this. Alexander accordingly warned Ferdinand to quit Rome as soon as possible in the interests of his own personal safety. But Ferdinand refused to listen to her words and declared that he would not go out at one gate while Charles VIII came in at another. His sojourn was not long. 2 days later, about 11 o'clock in the morning, a sentinel placed on a watchtower at the top of the Castel Sant'Angelo, whither the Pope had retired, cried out that the vanguard of the enemy was visible on the horizon. At once Alexander and the Duke of Calabria went up on the terrace which tops the fortress, and assured themselves with their own eyes that what the soldier said was true. Then, and not till then, did the Duke of Calabria mount on horseback and, to use his own words, went out at the gate of San Sebastiana, at the same moment that the French vanguard halted 500 feet from the gate of the people. This was on the 31st of December, 1494. At 3 in the afternoon the whole army had arrived, and the vanguard began their march, drums beating, ensigns unfurled. It was composed, says Paolo Giove, an eyewitness, Book 2, page 41 of his history, of Swiss and German soldiers, with short, tight coats of various colors. They were armed with short swords, with steel edges like those of the ancient Romans, and carried ashen lances 10 feet long, with straight and sharp iron spikes. Only 1/4 of their number bore halberts instead of lances, the spikes cut into the form of an axe and surmounted on a 4-cornered spike, to be used both for cutting like an axe and piercing like a bayonet. The first row of each battalion wore helmets and cuirasses which protected the head and chest, and when the men were drawn up for battle, they presented to the enemy a triple array of iron spikes, which they could raise or lower like the spines of a porcupine. To each 1,000 of the soldiery were attached 100 fusiliers. Their officers, to distinguish them from the men, wore lofty plumes on their helmets. After the Swiss came the archers of Gascony. There were 5,000 of them, wearing a very simple dress that contrasted with the rich costume of the Swiss soldiers, the shortest of whom would have been a head higher than the tallest of the Gascons. But they were excellent soldiers, full of courage, very light, and with a special reputation for quickness in stringing and drawing their iron bows. Behind them rode the cavalry, the flower of the French nobility, with their gilded helmets and neckbands, their velvet and silk surcoats, their swords, each of which had its own name, their shields, each telling of territorial estates, and their colors, each telling of a lady-love. Besides defensive arms, each man bore a lance in his hand, like an Italian gendarme, with a solid grooved end, and on his saddle bow a quantity of weapons, some for cutting and some for thrusting. Their horses were large and strong, but they had their tails and ears cropped according to the French custom. These horses, unlike those of the Italian gendarmes, wore no caparisons of dressed leather, which made them more exposed to attack. Every knight was followed by 3 horses, the first ridden by a page in armor like his own, the 2 others by equerries, who were called lateral auxiliaries, because in a fray they fought to right and left of their chief. This troop was not only the most magnificent, but the most considerable in the whole army, for as there were 2,500 knights, they formed each with their 3 followers a total of 10,000 men. 5,000 light horse rode next, who carried huge wooden bows and shot long arrows from a distance like English archers. They were a great help in battle, for moving rapidly wherever aid was required, they could fly in a moment from one wing to another, from the rear to the van. Then, when their quivers were empty, could go off at so swift a gallop that neither infantry nor heavy cavalry could pursue them. Their defensive armor consisted of a helmet and half cuirass. Some of them carried a short lance as well, with which to pin their stricken foe to the ground. They all wore long cloaks adorned with shoulder knots, and plates of silver whereon the arms of their chief were emblazoned. At last came the young king's escort. There were 400 archers, among whom 100 Scots formed a line on each side, while 200 of the most illustrious knights marched on foot beside the prince, carrying heavy arms on their shoulders. In the midst of this magnificent escort advanced Charles VIII, both he and his horse covered with splendid armor. On his right and left marched Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, the Duke of Milan's brother, and Cardinal Giuliano della Rovera, of whom we have spoken so often, who was afterwards Pope Julius II. The Cardinals Colonna and Cervelli followed immediately after, and behind them came Prospero and Fabrizio Colonna, and all the Italian princes and generals who had thrown in their lot with the conqueror, and were marching intermingled with the great French lords. For a long time the crowd that had collected to see all these foreign soldiers go by, a sight so new and strange, listened uneasily to a dull sound which got nearer and nearer. The earth visibly trembled, the glass shook in the windows, and behind the king's escort 36 bronze cannon were seen to advance, bumping along as they lay on their gun carriages. These cannons were 8 feet in length, and as their mouths were large enough to hold a man's head, it was supposed that each of these terrible machines, scarcely known as yet to the Italians, weighed nearly 6,000 pounds. After the cannons came culverins 16 feet long, and then falconets, the smallest of which shot balls the size of a grenade. This formidable artillery brought up the rear of the procession and formed the hindmost guard of the French army. It was 6 hours since the front guard entered the town, and as it was now night, and for every 6 artillerymen there was a torch-bearer, this illumination gave to the objects around a more gloomy character than they would have shown in the sunlight. The young king was to take up his quarters in the Palazzo di Venezia, and all the artillery was directed towards the plaza and the neighboring streets. The remainder of the army was dispersed about the town. The same evening they brought to the king, less to do honor to him than to assure him of his safety, the keys of Rome and the keys of the Belvedere Garden. Just the same thing had been done for the Duke of Calabria. The Pope, as we said, had retired to the Castel Sant'Angelo with only 6 cardinals. So from the day after his arrival, the young king had around him a court of very different brilliance from that of the head of the church. Then arose anew the question of a convocation to prove Alexander's simony and proceed to depose him. But the king's chief counselors, gained over as we know, pointed out that this was a bad moment to excite a new schism in the church, just when preparations were being made for war against the infidels. As this was also the king's private opinion, there was not much trouble in persuading him, and he made up his mind to treat with his holiness. But the negotiations had scarcely begun when they had to be broken off, for the first thing Charles VIII demanded was the surrender of the Castel Sant'Angelo, and as the Pope saw in this castle his only refuge, it was the last thing he chose to give up. Twice, in his youthful impatience, Charles wanted to take by force what he could not get by goodwill, and had his cannons directed towards the Holy Father's dwelling place. But the Pope was unmoved by these demonstrations, and obstinate as he was, this time it was the French king who gave way. This article, therefore, was set aside, and the following conditions were agreed upon: that there should be from this day forward between His Majesty the King of France and the Holy Father a sincere friendship and a firm alliance. Before the completion of the conquest of the kingdom of Naples, The King of France should occupy, for the advantage and accommodation of his army, the fortresses of Civitavecchia, Terracina, and Spoleto. Lastly, the Cardinal Valentino, this was now the name of Cesar Borgia after his archbishopric of Valencia, should accompany the king in the capacity of apostolic ambassador, really as a hostage. These conditions fixed, the ceremonial of an interview was arranged. The king left the Palazzo di Venezia and went to live in the Vatican. At the appointed time he entered by the door of a garden that adjoined the palace, while the Pope, who had not had to quit the Castel Sant'Angelo thanks to a corridor communicating between the two palaces, came down into the same garden by another gate. The result of this arrangement was that the king the next moment perceived the Pope and knelt down, but the Pope pretended not to see him, and the king, advancing a few paces, knelt a second time. As His Holiness was at that moment screened by some masonry, this supplied him with another excuse, and the king went on with the performance, got up again, once more advanced several steps, and was on the point of kneeling down the third time face to face, when the Holy Father at last perceived him, and walking towards him as though he would prevent him from kneeling, took off his own hat, and pressing him to his heart, raised him up and tenderly kissed his forehead, refusing to cover until the king had put his cap upon his head, with the aid of the Pope's own hands. Then, after they had stood for a moment exchanging polite and friendly speeches, the king lost no time in praying His Holiness to be so good as to receive into the Sacred College William Briconnet, the Bishop of St. Malo. As this matter had been agreed upon beforehand by that prelate and His Holiness, though the king was not aware of it, Alexander was pleased to get credit by promptly granting the request, and he instantly ordered one of his attendants to go to the house of his son, Cardinal Valentino, and fetch a cape and hat. Then, taking the king by the hand, he conducted him into the hall of Papagalli, where the ceremony was to take place of the admission of the new cardinal. The solemn oath of obedience which was to be taken by Charles to His Holiness as supreme head of the Christian Church was postponed till the following day. When that solemn day arrived, every person important in Rome, noble, cleric, or soldier, assembled around His Holiness. Charles, on his side, made his approach to the Vatican with a splendid following of princes, prelates, and captains. At the threshold of the palace he found 4 cardinals who had arrived before him. 2 of them placed themselves one on each side of him, the 2 others behind him, and all his retinue following. They traversed a long line of apartments full of guards and servants, and at last arrived in the reception room, where the Pope was seated on his throne with his son Cesar Borgia behind him. On his arrival at the door, the King of France began the usual ceremonial, and when he had gone on from genuflections to kissing the feet, the hand, and the forehead, he stood up while the first President of the Parliament of Paris, in his turn stepping forward, said in a loud voice, "Very Holy Father, behold my king ready to offer to your holiness that oath of obedience that he owes to you. But in France it is customary that he who offers himself as vassal to his lord shall receive in exchange therefor such boons as he may demand. His Majesty, therefore, while he pledges himself for his own part to behave unto your holiness with a munificence even greater than that wherewith your holiness shall behave unto him, is here to beg urgently that you accord him 3 favors. These favors are, first, the confirmation of privileges already granted to the king, to the queen his wife, and to the Dauphin his son. Secondly, the investiture for himself and his successors of the kingdom of Naples. Lastly, the surrender to him of the person of the Sultan Djem, brother of the Turkish emperor." At this address the Pope was for a moment stupefied, for he did not expect these 3 demands, which were moreover made so publicly by Charles that no manner of refusal was possible. But quickly recovering his presence of mind, He replied to the king that he would willingly confirm the privileges that had been accorded to the House of France by his predecessors, that he might therefore consider his first demand granted, that the investiture of the kingdom was an affair that required deliberation in a council of cardinals, but he would do all he possibly could to induce them to accede to the king's desire. Lastly, he must defer the affair of the Sultan's brother till a time more opportune for discussing it with the Sacred College, but would venture to say that, as this surrender could not fail to be for the good of Christendom, as it was demanded for the purpose of assuring further the success of a crusade, it would not be his fault if on this point also the king should not be satisfied. At this reply Charles bowed his head in sign of satisfaction, and the first president stood up, uncovered, and resumed his discourse as follows. Very Holy Father, it is an ancient custom among Christian kings, especially the most Christian kings of France, to signify through their ambassadors the respect they feel for the Holy See and the sovereign pontiffs whom divine providence places thereon. But the most Christian king, having felt a desire to visit the tombs of the holy apostles, has been pleased to pay this religious debt, which he regards as a sacred duty, not by ambassadors or by delegates, but in his own person. This is why, very Holy Father, His Majesty the King of France is here to acknowledge you as the true vicar of Christ, the legitimate successor of the apostles St. Peter and St. Paul, and with promise and vow renders you that filial and respectful devotion which the kings his predecessors have been accustomed to promise and vow, devoting himself and all his strength to the service of your holiness and the interests of the Holy See. End of section 10. Section 11. The Borgias. Chapter 5, Part 3. The Pope arose with a joyful heart, for this oath, so publicly made, removed all his fears about a council. So, inclined from this moment to yield to the King of France anything he might choose to ask, he took him by his left hand and made him a short and friendly reply, dubbing him the Church's eldest son. The ceremony over, they left the hall, the Pope always holding the King's hand in his, and in this way they walked as far as the room where the sacred vestments are put off. The Pope feigned a wish to conduct the King to his own apartments, but the King would not suffer this, and, embracing once more, they separated, each to retire to his own domicile. The King remained 8 days longer at the Vatican, then returned to the Palazzo San Marco. During these 8 days all his demands were debated and settled to his satisfaction. The Bishop of Mons was made cardinal. The investiture of the kingdom of Naples was promised to the conqueror. Lastly, it was agreed that on his departure the King of France should receive from the Pope's hand the brother of the Emperor of Constantinople for a sum of 120,000 livres. But the Pope, desiring to extend to the utmost the hospitality he had been bestowing, invited de Gesmes to dinner on the very day that he was to leave Rome with his new protector. When the moment of departure arrived, Charles mounted his horse in full armor, and with a numerous and brilliant following made his way to the Vatican. Arrived at the door, he dismounted, and leaving his escort at the Piazza of St. Peter, went up with a few gentlemen only. He found His Holiness waiting for him, with Cardinal Valentino on his right, and on his left de Gesmes, who, as we said before, was dining with him, and round the table 13 cardinals. The King at once, bending on his knee, demanded the Pope's benediction, and stooped to kiss his feet. But this Alexander would not suffer. He took him in his arms, and with the lips of a father and heart of an enemy, kissed him tenderly on his forehead. Then the Pope introduced the son of Mohammed II, who was a fine young man with something noble and regal in his air, presenting in his magnificent oriental costume a great contrast in its fashion and amplitude to the narrow, severe cut of the Christian apparel. De Gesmes advanced to Charles without humility and without pride, and, like an emperor's son treating with a king, kissed his hand and then his shoulder. and then, turning towards the Holy Father, he said in Italian, which he spoke very well, that he entreated he would recommend him to the young king, who was prepared to take him under his protection, assuring the pontiff that he should never have to repent giving him his liberty, and telling Charles that he hoped he might some day be proud of him if after taking Naples he carried out his intention of going on to Greece. These words were spoken with so much dignity and at the same time with such gentleness that the King of France loyally and frankly grasped the young Sultan's hand as though he were his companion in arms. Then Charles took a final farewell of the Pope and went down to the piazza. There he awaited Cardinal Valentino, who was about to accompany him, as we know, as a hostage, and who had remained behind to exchange a few words with his father. In a moment Cesar Borgia appeared, riding on a splendidly harnessed mule, and behind him were led 6 magnificent horses, a present from the Holy Father to the King of France. Charles at once mounted one of these, to do honor to the gift the Pope had just conferred on him, and leaving Rome with the rest of his troops, pursued his way towards Marino, where he arrived the same evening. He learned there that Alfonso, belying his reputation as a clever politician and great general, had just embarked with all his treasures in a flotilla of 4 galleys, leaving the care of the war and the management of his kingdom to his son Ferdinand. Thus everything went well for the triumphant march of Charles. The gates of towns opened of themselves at his approach. His enemies fled without waiting for his coming, and before he had fought a single battle he had won for himself the surname of Conqueror. The day after, at dawn, the army started once more, and after marching the whole day, stopped in the evening at Velletri. There the king, who had been on horseback since the morning with Cardinal Valentino and de Gesmes, left the former at his lodging, and taking de Gesmes with him, went on to his own. Then Cesar Borgia, who among the army baggage had 20 very heavy wagons of his own, had one of these opened, took out a splendid cabinet with the silver necessary for his table, and gave orders for his supper to be prepared as he had done the night before. Meanwhile night had come on, and he shut himself up in a private chamber, where, stripping off his cardinal's costume, he put on a groom's dress. Thanks to this disguise, he issued from the house that had been assigned for his accommodation without being recognized, traversed the streets, passed through the gates, and gained the open country. Nearly half a league outside the town a servant awaited him with 2 swift horses. Cesar, who was an excellent rider, sprang to the saddle, and he and his companion at full gallop retraced the road to Rome, where they arrived at break of day. Cesar got down at the house of one Flores, auditor of the Rota, where he procured a fresh horse and suitable clothes. Then he flew at once to his mother, who gave a cry of joy when she saw him, for so silent and mysterious was the cardinal for all the world beside, and even for her, that he had not said a word of his early return to Rome. The cry of joy uttered by Rosa Venozza when she beheld her son was far more a cry of vengeance than of love. One evening, while everybody was at the rejoicings in the Vatican, when Charles VIII and Alexander VI were swearing a friendship which neither of them felt, and exchanging oaths that were broken beforehand, a messenger from Rosa Venozza had arrived with a letter to Cesar, in which she begged him to come at once to her house in the Via della Longara. Cesar questioned the messenger, but he only replied that he could tell him nothing, that he would learn all he cared to know from his mother's own lips. So, as soon as he was at liberty, Cesar, in layman's dress, and wrapped in a large cloak, quitted the Vatican and made his way towards the church of Regina Caeli, in the neighborhood of which, it will be remembered, was the house where the Pope's mistress lived. As he approached his mother's house, Cesar began to observe the signs of strange devastation. The street was scattered with the wreck of furniture and strips of precious stuffs. As he arrived at the foot of the little flight of steps that led to the entrance gate, he saw that the windows were broken and the remains of torn curtains were fluttering in front of them. Not understanding what this disorder could mean, he rushed into the house and through several deserted and wrecked apartments. At last, seeing light in one of the rooms, he went in, and there he found his mother sitting on the remains of a chest made of ebony all inlaid with ivory and silver. When she saw Cesar, she rose, pale and dishevelled, and pointing to the desolation around her, exclaimed, "Look, Cesar, behold the work of your new friends." "But what does it mean, mother?" asked the cardinal. "Whence comes all this disorder?" "From the serpent," replied Rosa Venozza, gnashing her teeth. "From the serpent you have warmed in your bosom. He has bitten me, fearing no doubt that his teeth would be broken on you." "Who has done this?" cried Cesar. "Tell me, and by heaven, mother, he shall pay, and pay indeed." "Who?" replied Rosa. "King Charles VIII has done it, by the hands of his faithful allies, the Swiss. It was well known that Melchior was away, and that I was living alone with a few wretched servants, so they came and broke in the doors, as though they were taking Rome by storm, and while Cardinal Valentino was making holiday with their master, they pillaged his mother's house, loading her with insults and outrages which no Turks or Saracens could possibly have improved upon." "Very good, mother, very good," said Cesar. "Be calm. Blood shall wash out disgrace. Consider a moment. What we have lost is nothing compared with what we might lose. And my father and I, you may be quite sure, will give you back more than they have stolen from you." "I ask for no promises," cried Rosa. "I ask for revenge." "My mother," said the cardinal, "you shall be avenged, or I will lose the name of son." Having by these words reassured his mother, he took her to Lucrezia's palace, which in consequence of her marriage with Pizarro was unoccupied, and himself returned to the Vatican, giving orders that his mother's house should be refurnished more magnificently than before the disaster. These orders were punctually executed, and it was among her new luxurious surroundings, but with the same hatred in her heart, that Cesar on this occasion found his mother. This feeling prompted her cry of joy when she saw him once more. The mother and son exchanged a very few words. Then Cesar, mounting on horseback, went to the Vatican, whence as a hostage he had departed 2 days before. Alexander, who knew of the flight beforehand, and not only approved, but as sovereign pontiff had previously absolved his son of the perjury he was about to commit, received him joyfully, but all the same advised him to lie concealed, as Charles in all probability would not be slow to reclaim his hostage. Indeed, the next day when the king got up, the absence of Cardinal Valentino was observed, and as Charles was uneasy at not seeing him, he sent to inquire what had prevented his appearance. When the messenger arrived at the house that Cesar had left the evening before, he learnt that he had gone out at 9 o'clock in the evening, and had not returned since. He went back with this news to the king, who at once suspected that he had fled, and in the first flush of his anger let the whole army know of his perjury. The soldiers then remembered the 20 wagons, so heavily laden, from one of which the cardinal, in the sight of all, had produced such magnificent gold and silver plate, and never doubting that the cargo of the others was equally precious, they fetched them down and broke them to pieces. But inside they found nothing but stones and sand, which proved to the king that the flight had been planned a long time back, and incensed him doubly against the Pope. So without loss of time he dispatched to Rome Philippe de Bresse, afterwards Duke of Savoy, with orders to intimate to the Holy Father his displeasure at this conduct. But the Pope replied that he knew nothing whatever about his son's flight, and expressed the sincerest regret to his Majesty, declaring that he knew nothing of his whereabouts, but was certain that he was not in Rome. As a fact, the Pope was speaking the truth this time, for Cesar had gone with Cardinal Orsini to one of his estates, and was temporarily in hiding there. This reply was conveyed to Charles by 2 messengers from the Pope, the bishops of Naples and Sutri, and the people also sent an ambassador in their own behalf. He was Monsignore Porcari, Dean of the Rota, who was charged to communicate to the king the displeasure of the Romans when they learned of the cardinal's breach of faith. Little as Charles was disposed to content himself with empty words, he had to turn his attention to more serious affairs. So he continued his march to Naples without stopping, arriving there on Sunday, the 22nd of February, 1495. 4 days later, the unlucky de Gem, who had fallen sick at Capua, died at Castel Nuovo. When he was leaving at the farewell banquet, Alexander had tried on his guest the poison he intended to use so often later on upon his cardinals, and whose effects he was destined to feel himself. Such is poetical justice. In this way the Pope had secured a double haul, for, in his twofold speculation in this wretched young man, he had sold him alive to Charles for 120,000 livres, and sold him dead to Bajazet for 300,000 ducats. But there was a certain delay about the second payment, for the Turkish emperor, as we remember, was not bound to pay the price of fratricide till he received the corpse, and by Charles's order the corpse had been buried at Gaeta. When César Borgia learned the news, he rightly supposed that the king would be so busy settling himself in his new capital that he would have too much to think of to be worrying about him. So he went to Rome again, and, anxious to keep his promise to his mother, he signaled his return by a terrible vengeance. Cardinal Valentino had in his service a certain Spaniard whom he had made the chief of his bravos. He was a man of 35 or 40, whose whole life had been one long rebellion against society's laws. He recoiled from no action, provided only that he could get his price. This Don Michele Correglia, who earned his celebrity for bloody deeds under the name of Michelotto, was just the man César wanted, and whereas Michelotto felt an unbounded admiration for César, César had unlimited confidence in Michelotto. It was to him the cardinal entrusted the execution of one part of his vengeance. The other he kept for himself. Don Michele received orders to scour the Campagna and cut every French throat he could find. He began his work at once, and very few days elapsed before he had obtained most satisfactory results. More than 100 persons were robbed or assassinated, and among the last, the son of Cardinal de Saint-Malo, who was on his way back to France, and on whom Michelotto found a sum of 3,000 crowns. For himself César reserved the Swiss, for it was the Swiss in particular who had despoiled his mother's house. The Pope had in his service about 150 soldiers belonging to their nation, who had settled their families in Rome, and had grown rich partly by their pay and partly in the exercise of various industries. The cardinal had every one of them dismissed, with orders to quit Rome within 24 hours, and the Roman territories within 3 days. The poor wretches had all collected together to obey the order, with their wives and children and baggage, on the piazza of St. Peter, when suddenly, by Cardinal Valentino's orders, they were hemmed in on all sides by 2,000 Spaniards, who began to fire on them with their guns and charge them with their sabers, while César and his mother looked down upon the carnage from a window. In this way they killed 50 or perhaps 60, but the rest coming up made a charge at the assassins, and then, without suffering any loss, managed to beat a retreat to a house where they stood a siege, and made so valiant a defense that they gave the Pope time, he knew nothing of the author of this butchery, to send a captain of his guard to the rescue, who, with a strong detachment, succeeded in getting nearly 40 of them safely out of the town. The rest had been massacred on the piazza or killed in the house. But this was no real and adequate revenge, for it did not touch Charles himself, the sole author of all the troubles that the Pope and his family had experienced during the last year. So César soon abandoned vulgar schemes of this kind, and busied himself with loftier concerns, bending all the force of his genius to restore the League of Italian Princes that had been broken by the defection of Sforza, the exile of Piero dei Medici, and the defeat of Alfonso. The enterprise was more easily accomplished than the Pope could have anticipated. The Venetians were very uneasy when Charles passed so near, and they trembled lest, when he was once master of Naples, he might conceive the idea of conquering the rest of Italy. Ludovico Sforza, on his side, was beginning to tremble, seeing the rapidity with which the King of France had dethroned the House of Aragon, lest he might not make much difference between his allies and his enemies. Maximilian, for his part, was only seeking an occasion to break the temporary peace which he had granted for the sake of the concession made to him. Lastly, Ferdinand and Isabella were allies of the dethroned house. And so it came about that all of them, for different reasons, felt a common fear, and were soon in agreement as to the necessity of driving out Charles VIII, not only from Naples, but from Italy, and pledged themselves to work together to this end by every means in their power, by negotiations, by trickery, or by actual force. The Florentines alone refused to take part in this general levy of arms, and remained faithful to their promises. According to the articles of the treaty agreed upon by the Confederates, the alliance was to last for 25 years, and had for ostensible object the upholding of the majority of the Pope and the interests of Christendom. And these preparations might well have been taken for such as would proceed a crusade against the Turks, if the Jesuits' ambassadors had not always been present at the deliberations, although the Christian princes could not have dared for very shame to admit the Sultan by name into their league. Now the Confederates had to set on foot an army of 30,000 horse and 20,000 infantry, and each of them was taxed for a contingent. Thus the Pope was to furnish 4,000 horse, Maximilian 6,000, the King of Spain, the Duke of Milan, and the Republic of Venice 8,000 each. Every Confederate was, in addition to this, to levy and equip 4,000 infantry in the 6 weeks following the signature of the treaty. The fleets were to be equipped by the maritime states, but any expenses they should incur later on were to be defrayed by all in equal shares. The formation of this league was made public on the 12th of April, 1495, Palm Sunday, and in all the Italian states, especially at Rome, was made the occasion of fetes and immense rejoicings. Almost as soon as the publicly known articles were announced, the secret ones were put into execution. These obliged Ferdinand and Isabella to send a fleet of 60 galleys to Ischia, where Alfonso's son had retired, with 600 horsemen on board and 5,000 infantry, to help him to ascend the throne once more. Those troops were to be put under the command of Gonzalvo of Cordova, who had gained the reputation of the greatest general in Europe after the taking of Granada. The Venetians, with a fleet of 40 galleys under the command of Antonio Grimani, were to attack all the French stations on the coast of Calabria and Naples. The Duke of Milan promised for his part to check all reinforcements as they should arrive from France, and to drive the Duke of Orleans out of Asti. Lastly, there was Maximilian, who had promised to make invasions on the frontiers, and Bajazet, who was to help with money, ships, and soldiers, either the Venetians or the Spaniards, according as he might be appealed to by Barbarigo or by Ferdinand the Catholic. This league was all the more disconcerting for Charles because of the speedy abatement of the enthusiasm that had hailed his first appearance. What had happened to him was what generally happens to a conqueror who has more good luck than talent. Instead of making himself a party among the great Neapolitan and Calabrian vassals, whose roots would be embedded in the very soil by confirming their privileges and augmenting their power, he had wounded their feelings by bestowing all the titles, offices, and fiefs on those alone who had followed him from France, so that all the important positions in the kingdom were filled by strangers. The result was that just when the league was made known, Tropea and Amantea, which had been presented by Charles to the